This is Jewish Talk, coming to you live from NASA Community College on 90.3 WHPC, also streaming on the iHeart and the iTunes app. This program is later archived on Spreaker.com. So hi there, my name is Rabbi Perl. Today is Tisha B'Av. Translates the 9th day of the month of Av. It is today the saddest day on the Jewish calendar, on which we fast, we deprive ourselves, and we pray. Today is the culmination of the 3 weeks, a period of time during which we mark the destruction of the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. What exactly happened on this day, on the 9th of Av? Well, in the year 1313 BCE, before the Common Era, it goes back to that time when spies had returned from the Promised Land with frightening reports, and the Israelites balked at the prospect of entering the land all the way back. God decreed that they would therefore wander in the desert for 40 years. That's the reason why the Jewish people ended up wandering through the desert for 40 years. Both holy temples in Jerusalem were destroyed on this date. I note, of course, today is actually the 10th day, and typically all this happens on the 9th, but since the 9th, yesterday, was Saturday, we don't fast on a Saturday, on a Shabbos, and therefore everything is moved to this very day. So again, we're talking about the 9th of Av, what makes this day the saddest day in the Jewish calendar. The first temple was burnt down by the Babylonians in the year 423 BCE. The second temple fell to the Romans in the year 70 of the Common Era. And that unleashed a period of suffering from which it's hard to say if we really recovered. On this day, the Bar Kokhba revolt against the Romans in the year 133 BCE ended in defeat. At that time, those who were living in Beitar were butchered on the 9th of Av, and the Temple Mount was plowed 1 year later on this very same day. Later in our history, many more tragedies happened on this day, including the 1290 expulsion of the Jewish community from England, and again in 1492, the banishment of all Jewish people from Spain. How exactly is this day observed? Well, no eating and no drinking. I am wearing non-leather footwear. We do not bathe or wash ourselves. We do not apply ointments or creams, engage in marital relations or any form of intimacy. And until midday, we do not sit on a normal size chair. And of course, the study, we are very careful not to study Torah except for those sad parts that deal with the destruction of the temple and the subjects that we are discussing this morning. On this day, Tisha B'Av, we don't send gifts or even greet each other. We don't engage in outings, trips, or similar pleasurable activities. We do not wear our finest or our festive clothing either. Tisha B'Av evening services were held in the synagogue last night, and if you were to visit a synagogue, you will see that the covering of the ark typically has a decorative curtain. This is taken off, is pushed to the side, and the lights are actually dimmed in the synagogues. And the evening prayers, which took place last night, included the chanting of the Eichar, the Lamentations. In the morning prayers today, prayers are held without wearing the talis and the tefillin, because both of them are considered adornments. And most of this morning is occupied by reading kinos, which is lamentations, elegies, marking the various tragedies that befell our people. Work is permitted on this day, but discouraged. On this day, one focuses primarily on mourning and repentance. If a person must work, it is preferable to begin after midday. It is customary to give extra charity on Tisha B'Av, as we would on any other fast day. After midday, which is approximately 1 o'clock, it is permissible to sit on chairs, and once again during the afternoon services, in our case it'll be at 1:38 p.m., once again, we will be doing the afternoon prayer wearing our talis and our tefillin. And at that time, after midday, the ark's curtain is restored to its place. And many communities actually have the custom to clean the house in the afternoon and wash the floors after midday as an expression of the anticipation of the coming of Mashiach, of redemption, which we all await. It's just like you would prepare the house for a special guest, so too we look forward to the anticipation of the coming of Mashiach. And so, dear friends, as I come to you today, I'm going to share with you a number of aspects, a number of perspectives on this whole day of Tisha B'Av, so all of us can be inspired and understand what is going on. So even as we mourn, there's an element of joy and comfort. How could I say this? Indeed, in the reading of the Eichel, the reading of the Lamentations, it concludes, Hashivenu Alecha, restore to us, Chadish Yemenu Yemei Kedem, renew for us our days of old. We look forward. Even during the day, there's a constant refrain of looking forward to the joy that is within this sadness. There's also the custom that many have that if you're using a rather, a paperback kind of prayer book, that we don't have a certain sense of permanency to the actual prayer booklet, because we won't need to use it again next year. It is by no accident that in the scriptures refers to this day, even with all of its sadnesses and all the aspects that we're discussing, it's referred to as a moed. That is the Hebrew word for holiday. And tachan, the prayers of repentance, is not said today. May the time soon come when we look back with the clarity of the hindsight to see how all of our difficulties and challenges were, but they really were a prelude to the happiness and the goodness and the coming of Mashiach. You see, let's take another perspective here. Each one of us can be likened to a holy temple. As we discussed, on this date, the 9th of Av, we remember how 2 temples were destroyed. It's imperative for us to appreciate that each one of us can see ourselves like a holy temple. Let's start rebuilding by repairing our own inner fragments. Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, commemorates the destruction of both the first and second temples, and is designated to be the saddest day of the year on the Jewish calendar. It is also one of the most challenging because I have a hard time summoning the appropriate emotions and feeling sad on command. Life is hard enough these days without having to pile on. It's not that I'm callous, but in general, I resist negative feelings and emotional discomfort. Especially in this season, many of us are enjoying long-awaited vacations and no longer confined by shutdowns. We don't want the light to darken even for a day. So, if you find it hard to relate to the events that broke the Jewish people over 2,000 years ago, here's a suggestion of how we can tap into the energy of what this day is all about. We ask ourselves these questions. Is there nothing broken in your world, in your community, in your relationships, in your family? And what about you? Is there nothing shattered, damaged, or fragmented in your own heart that needs healing? The soul of every one of us yearns for peace. But how can we possibly achieve that if we have no inner peace? Every one of us is likened to a holy temple. So, whether you long for the rebuilding of the third temple, or just a better and kinder world with less hate and greater consciousness, perhaps we could start with ourselves. Think global, yet act local, as the saying goes. And one way is to repair the brokenness within, the places where we are fragmented, like a house divided against itself. The good child, people pleaser, the savior, hero, or rescuer, emotional caretaker, the risk manager, critic. Do any of these personalities resonate with us? They are all examples of sub-personalities we created as children when we had to curtail normal needs, emotions, or even talents and abilities, or suffer the wounds and the negative emotional consequences of rejection. Our shadow self is everything about us that we can't see. As children, we are dependent on our parents or other caretakers for our very survival. We think rejecting these parts keeps us safe, loved, wanted, or maybe just tolerated. Therefore, it is not just a defense mechanism, but a brilliant coping strategy that ensures our survival when we reject, disallow, or hide the parts of ourselves that doesn't please those on whom our existence relies. And we have hidden these parts so well that over time, even we don't know they are there, to the point where we cannot reclaim our identity. However, these parts never disappear. Instead, they live in what the psychologist Carl Jung calls the shadow self. Remember the film, the show, The Shadow Knows. In a nutshell, the shadow is everything about us that we can't see. And here's the rub, so to speak. As adults, our shadow self can cause dysfunctional behavior, negatively impact relationships, and shape a warped view of reality. When we get upset at other people, we are often upset at the very behaviors that we have going on inside of us that we don't admit are there. This behavior is known as projection, meaning we project onto other people our own hidden deficiencies, which, by the way, everyone knows is there but us. This tendency is so strong that sometimes we even project negative behavior when the other person is objectively blameless. It's the proverbial pot calling the kettle black, even when the kettle is white. If the shadow self is everything about yourself and you can't see, how then can you integrate what you can't see? Sounds like a joke. Don't be discouraged, however, because that which causes pain is also the key to healing. Put it simply, if you spot it, you got it. Think about behaviors you find offensive and irritating. especially someone with whom you experience a personal conflict. Your emotional reaction is a big clue to your inner world. If you have a persistent emotional response, there's an excellent chance that you are reacting to something that is mirroring an aspect of yourself you cannot see. A simple example: behind every person who can't stand to be controlled is often someone who is very controlling, who doesn't own their behavior. In no way am I excusing, justifying, or minimizing anyone's offensive conduct. However, if their behavior triggers you repeatedly, there's something for you to learn about yourself. It may not seem obvious on the surface, but if you drill into the deeper aspects of hot-button issues, chances are you will find some element that may apply to you now or in the past, where you were insensitive to someone else in the same or similar way. The point of this inner self-awareness is not to beat yourself up or to turn the finger of blame against yourself, but to have compassion for another person and yourself by recognizing the commonality or universality of the struggle. Instead of holding others to an impossible high standard of perfection while you let yourself slide, you go from "that's you, but not me" to "that's you and me too." Or maybe it's just you. When our judgments soften and anger subsides, and we accept the inevitable flaws of others and ourselves, we begin to build peace. When our judgments soften and anger subsides, and we accept the inevitable flaws of others and ourselves, again, I emphasize, we begin to build peace. And maybe we can realize that what we perceived as childhood flaws or fears, such as being emotional, vulnerable, or self-affirming, are not flaws, but strengths, or just part of the human condition. You know, there's the famous poem, Song of Myself, by Walt Whitman, and he writes, "Do I contradict myself? Very well then, I can contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes." We have very multiple facets to our personality. Everyone is a mixture of positive and negative characteristics that manifest under different circumstances. When we learn to integrate our unconscious and reject parts which has been rejected into our bring it forward into our consciousness and allows those parts to express themselves positively, we can heal from our wounds and become more whole. As Carl Jung so beautifully said, there is no light without shadow and no psychic wholeness without imperfection. So, may we behold ourselves and others with less judgment and more compassion, more empathy, and more kindness. May that which needs to be healed be healed, and may we really send that healing into a broken world. And may we know redemption. May we suffer no more. And may we know only peace. And I continue this idea. You see, one of the hardest feelings for a human soul to grapple with is the feelings of being trapped. Trapped in a dead-end job. Trapped in an unhealthy relationship, trapped by our own negative habits and inner demons. Even when facing a monumental hardship, if there is a sense of forward moving, of progress, the pain of hardship is not as intense. But when a person feels trapped, when no clarity on how to proceed or any hope for things to change, the pain is infinitely worse. The 3 weeks between the 17th of the Hebrew month of Tammuz and the 9th of the Hebrew month of Av, these last 3 weeks that concludes today have a special name in the Jewish language. It's called Bein Hamtzarim, between the straits. And during this period, the Jewish people the world over have entered into a period of constriction, of minimizing outward expressions of joy and observing different customs associated with mourning. For example, this past 9 days, except for the Sabbath, we did not eat any meat or drink any wine. As this name so clearly implies, these 3 weeks are hard. Between the straits, we reflect on the spirituality and the physical destruction events that occurred between the breaching of the Jerusalem's walls on the beginning of these, commemorating the beginning of these 3 weeks, the 17th of Tammuz, and as I mentioned earlier on, the fall of the temples on the 9th day in the year 70 CE. Even today, it's considered as an inauspicious time where negative forces manifest more freely in the world. But despite their connection with energies of destruction, these 3 weeks are on a deeper level permeated with powerfully positive spiritual influences as well. In our time-bound world, Bein HaMetzarim, this period of time occurs during the summer, when the sun is at its strongest. In Jewish mysticism, teaches that every detail of our world here below is a reflection of what's going on behind the scenes in the spiritual worlds above. Every physical object and circumstance is the manifestation of its corresponding spiritual force and of interactions between the individual spiritual forces. The sun is associated spiritually with a divine name called Havaya, a name of God that expresses his attributes of compassion and revelation. So here, think about this. The strength of the sun during this period of time, Bein HaMetzarim, tells us that during the darkest period on the Jewish calendar, God's love and compassion are in truth shining the brightest. Every human being is a microcosm of the universe at large, and so each of us, in our journeys through this world, experience our own periods of Bein HaMetzarim, our own periods of personal destruction, when the sacred spaces within us and within our own lives feels razed to the ground, and we feel trapped in the wreckage of what was. But it is precisely during these periods of the deepest darkness that the light of compassion shines the strongest in our souls, that the infinite itself is revealed before us. Because destruction, like all other forces in the universe, is filled with divine purpose. The Hasidic masters teach that the inner purpose of the Holy Temple's destruction is to facilitate the ultimate building of the next and final Holy Temple, which will signify humanity's elevation to the ultimate state of God's consciousness. So, too, in the microcosm of our own lives, the inner purpose of all destruction is the ultimate construction of a newer and higher consciousness, of a fortified temple within each of us, where the essence of the infinite is manifestly revealed. So within darkness, the most potent light is hidden. Within chaos, the highest divine order is concealed. It's up to us to reveal it. Let's continue this idea. And this will also on the same theme, that in the darkest of the darkest is the potential for the greatest light. Let me share the following. I would like to call this the intimacy in flames. Let me first start with a little story. An airline was having engine trouble, and the pilot instructed the cabin crew to have the passengers take their seats and get prepared for an emergency landing. A few minutes later, the pilot asked the flight attendants if everyone was buckled in and ready. "All set back here, Captain," came the reply, except one lawyer who is still going around passing out his business cards. Why do I tell you this? Again, on the 9th month of the month of Av, in the year 17 CE, today that we are gathering on and celebrating, This is the day when the Roman legions in Jerusalem smashed through the fortress tower of Antonia into the holy temple and set it afire. In the blackened remains of the sanctuary lay more than the ruins of the great Jewish revolt for political independence. It appeared that Judaism itself was shattered beyond repair. Out of approximately 4 to 5 million Jews in the world, over 1 million died in that abortive war of independence. Many died of starvations, others by fire. So many were sold into slavery and given over to the gladiatorial arenas and circuses that the price of slaves dropped tremendously, fulfilling an ancient curse. The destruction was preceded by events so devastating that from an objective perspective it seemed that the Jewish people at that time had breathed their last breath. This is what amazed a philosopher like Nietzsche, a fierce and faithful critic of Jewish people, as it has so many of other thinkers throughout the ages. In Twilight of the Idols and other philosophical books, they write, the Jews are the most remarkable people in the history of the world, for when they were confronted with the question to be or not to be, they chose with perfectly unearthly deliberation to be at any price. They defined themselves counter to all those conditions under which a nation was previously able to live. Psychologically, they write that the Jewish people are a people gifted with the very strongest vitality. So what's this achieved? How can this be? Despite all that's gone on, we continue to be here. The Talmud relates a very profound, strange incident that occurred moments before the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. And I quote, "When the pagans entered the holy temple, they saw the cherubs, the cherubim, cleaving to one another. They took them out to the street and said, 'Look, is this what they occupy themselves with?' With this they debased, as it is written, all who had honored her had despised her, for they had seen her nakedness." The meaning of these words is, the innermost chamber of the Jerusalem temple, the most sacred site in Judaism, was known as the Holies of Holies, and seen as the spiritual epicenter of the universe. In there were 2 golden cherubs. There were 2 winged figures, one male and one female, which were located in the Holy of Holies. These cherubim represented the relationship between the cosmic groom and bride, between God and his people. And the Talmud teaches that when the relationship between the groom and the bride were sour, the 2 faces were turned away from each other, as when spouses are angry with each other. When the relationship was healthy, the 2 faces of the cherubim were facing each other. And when the love between God and his bride was at its peak, the cherubs would embrace as a man that cleaves to his wife. So now the Talmud is telling us, amazing, listen dear friends, that when the enemies of Israel invaded the temple at that time, during this destruction, they entered into the Holies of Holies, a place so sacred that it was permitted only to a single individual, the high priest, and only on Yom Kippur, the Holies of Holies of the holiest day of the year. What did they find when they got into there? Can you imagine? Everything was destroyed. Terrible things are going on. They found the cherubim, these 2 faces. They found them embracing each other. What did they do? They dragged them out of the temple into the streets and vulgarized their sacred significance. Now this seems bizarre. When the enemies of Israel invaded the temple to destroy it, we're talking about everything was being destroyed. The relationship between God At that point was at its lowest possible point. That was the reason why there was the destruction going on and the subsequent exile. The Jewish people at that time were about to become estranged for millennia. The manifest presence of the divinity of the world, which was through the temple of Jerusalem, would cease. There would be exile. Yet paradoxically, it was precisely that moment that the cherubim, these cherubs, were intertwined, symbolizing the most profoundest relationship between God and ourselves. How are we to understand this? How do we understand it? Everything's burning and destroyed, and yet these cherubim were actually facing each other and clasping each other. How are we to understand this? I want to share with you the most daring explanation given by the heir to the founder of Hasidism, Rav Dov Ber, known as the Maggid of Mizrich. He lived in the 1770s. Quoting the injunction of the sages that a man ought to consort with his wife prior to leaving home on a journey, the Maggid suggests that God, prior to his long journey away from his home, expressed his intimacy with us. Prior to the onset of this long exile, the cherubim were intertwined, representing the intimacy preceding the journey. What the Hasidic master was conveying through this dazzling metaphor, and its central theme in Hasidic thought, was that it was at that moment of the destruction that a new relationship between God and ourselves was beginning to develop. The greatest moment of crisis was also the moment of intimacy. As the temple was going up in flames, and with that so much of Jewish life and history, God, and metaphorically speaking, was impregnating a seed of life within our souls. He was implanting within each and every one of us the potential for new birth. So for 2,000 years, that seed has sustained us, giving us the courage and the inspiration to live and to prosper. Judaism has flourished in the decades and the centuries following the destruction of the temple in an unprecedented fashion. The Mishnah, the Talmud, the Medrash, the Kabbalah are all born during these centuries. The very tragic conditions of exile became catalysts for unparalleled rejuvenation. The closing, as we would say, as one door closed, many more opened up. Many empires, religions, and cultures attempted to demonstrate that it was the end, but it would never be, luring them in it's time to just disappear into the surrounding, pervading cultures. But the intimacy they experienced, so to speak, with God just moments before he departed from them has left this indelible mark. It imbued us with a vision, a dream, an unshakable commitment. Throughout the journeys, often filled with extraordinary anguish, because also the dates of Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, is also the day when the First World War began, which ultimately brought to the Second World War. And many aspects of the Holocaust are also associated with Tisha B'Av. So that despite all of this, we've clung to the faith and continued this covenant to transform the world into a divine abode and to continue to help heal a fractured world yearning to reunite with its own true reality. This gives us a deeper understanding into the ancient tradition that Mashiach was born on the 9th of Av. The Mashiach is born on this day. At the moment the temple was about to be engulfed in flames, the dream of redemption was born. There was an intimacy in the flames, and it produced a hidden seed that would eventually bring healing to a broken world. Think about this. The very possibility for the rabbis of those generations to declare that Mashiach was born on the 9th of Av was nothing but testimony to the intimacy that accompanied the milieu of estrangement and the exile followed that. Now we are finally ready for this birth. Allow me now to share with you the story that the Talmud discusses, and it's always studied on this day. It comes from the Talmud called Gittin, page 55b. It tells us the following story. The temple was destroyed because of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, for there was a certain individual who was friendly with Kamsa, but who was an enemy of a man named Bar Kamsa. He made a feast and said to his servant, "Go and bring Kamsa, my friend, to my feast." But the servant instead brought Bar Kamsa, the enemy. The one who made the feast found Bar Kamsa, his sworn enemy, seated there. He said to him, "Since you are my enemy, what are you doing here? Get up and get out." Bar Kamsa said, "Since I'm here already, let me stay, and I will pay you for what I eat and drink." The host responded, "No, I will pay for half the cost of the feast." His enemy, Bar Kamsa, said, "No, I will pay for the entire cost of the feast." "No." And he seized Bar Kamsa, stood him up, and he threw him out. Continuing now, I'm quoting from the Talmud. Bar Kamsa thought, since the rabbis were there, saw the whole thing, and did not protest, obviously they had no objection to my embarrassment. I'll go now and slander them to the king. Bar Kamsa, the enemy, was thrown out of the party. What did he do? He went to the Caesar and declared, the Jewish community is rebelling against you. This false report eventually caused the Romans to launch their war and destroy the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. And this takes place in the year 70 of the Common Era. Our sages don't tell us stories just to entertain us. Every story recorded in the Talmud is full of life lessons and moral teachings. And as we read these stories, we are to dig within them and extract the relevant messages that apply to ourselves. Some of these lessons are obvious, clearly stated in the text, and need little thought to grasp them. Others require deep analysis and closer reading of the details to uncover them. Let's spend a few moments analyzing this. The story of the Bar Kamsa has an obvious theme, of course. It shows just how far discord and infighting can go. A fight erupts at a party. The host cannot tolerate his enemy's presence at his celebration, and he throws him out, causing him to become an informant and eventually causing the destruction of the Holy Temple. What started as a personal conflict snowballed into a national calamity. The fury and rage of one moment had the impact that lasted millennia. One man's gripe became an entire nation's tragedy. We see from here just how easily a person can be overtaken with anger and hatred, and just how damaging the effects of that anger can be. But by looking closer at the characters of this story, we will see that our sages are not just teaching us a lesson in the destructive power of discord, but they are also exposing a more subtle and less recognized damage. The two people involved, the protagonists of this story, the party host and his enemy Bar Kamsa, are the paradigms of two types of hatred. Bar Kamsa, the guy who went and slandered on the Jewish people to Rome, presents an example of a radically impulsive individual whose fury causes him to go mad and fall to the lowest type of behavior. The host of the party, on the other hand, displayed a calculated, thought-out, ideological, and cold-hearted type of hatred. Let's so to speak, dear friends, let's take these two guys to the shrink. A close analysis of the story shows that both of these characters, the host and his enemy Bar Kamsa, seem like fine people. The party host must have been a respected, honorable community member. We see from his guest list that he could not have been anything but respectable, because there were scholars and sages of the time. They were all gracing his gathering. The Talmud warns scholars to be extra careful about the company they keep and which social engagements they attend. Surely, had the host been a known lowlife or person of ill character, he would not have had such a prestigious circle of acquaintances. It is clear that he was considered an upright man. Now let's look at Bar Kamsa. Similarly, Bar Kamsa, at least on the first impression, seems to be quite a mensch. He accepted an invitation to the party of someone who was his enemy. Why? Well, perhaps he's hoping to make amends and bury the hatchet at the time of the celebration. When it becomes clear that his presence is unwanted, he makes every effort to solve things amicably. He is willing to be out of pocket in order to maintain some modicum of peace, right, and harmony. He's ready to cover the costs of the entire party, from the reception to the Viennese table, just to keep this quiet and keep it quiet in Menschlich. At this stage of the story, till the hosts expel him, we would view Bar Kamsa as being a pretty decent guy, and the host as being a respectable character. But as things unfold, we get to see the ugly side of both of these characters. The civility and respectability are exposed as being facades, thin veils covering over a rather simmering hatred just beneath the surface. As soon as his enemy appears, the host, right, as we're saying, the host, what does he do? As soon as his enemy appears, the host loses all sense of decency and decorum, and shine, he throws him out. Conversely, as soon as he is disgraced, this Bar Kamsa becomes an ugly, despicable informant to the Romans. And yet, the way these two adversaries behave while sharing a common denominator are actually very different. Both display a deep-seated hatred, but in fact they each exhibit polar opposite expressions of this common trait of a deep-seated hatred. What's the saying? Remember the saying? Speak when you're angry, and you will make the best speech you will ever regret. That's how the saying goes. Bar Kamsa, in his moment of anger, reacts so extremely, so harshly, that it's hard to believe a man can stoop so low. 1 minute, he's a reasonable person trying to navigate a tricky social dilemma. Right? He's willing to pay for his meal. The next, he's a vicious avenger, willing to go at any length to set things straight and even the score. He was so consumed with anger that it transformed him from a normal person to a murderous snitcher. He knew full well what the consequences would be if the Romans suspected that there was a rebellion going on. But the consequences don't matter when your heart is alight with rage and the fire of anger burns violently in your eyes. A fire doesn't consider the destruction it will cause. Before you know it, the fire has consumed everything, including you, your morals, and your values. How many families have been broken up due to just 1 minute of anger? How many marriages have crumbled under the strain of just a few deadly words thoughtlessly spoken? Flying off the handle sometimes causes hammers and humans to lose their heads as well as their effectiveness. There was a young student with a bad temper. His mentor gave him a bag of nails and told him every time he lost his temper to hammer a nail in the back fence of the school. The first day, the student had driven 37 nails into the fence. Then it gradually dwindled down. He discovered that it was easier to hold his temper than to drive those nails into the fence. Finally, the day came when the student didn't lose his temper at all. He told his mentor about it, and the mentor suggested that the pupil now pull out one nail for each day that he was able to hold his temper. The days passed, and the young pupil was finally able to tell his mentor that all the nails were gone. The mentor took his student by the hand and led him to the fence. He said, "You have done well, my son, but look at the holes in the fence. The fence will never be the same. When you say things in anger, they leave a scar just like this one. You can put a knife in a man and draw it out. It won't matter how many times you say, 'I'm sorry,' the wound is still there." But if Bar Kamsa was rash and impulsive in his hateful response, his host was just the opposite. There is no indication that his was a rash decision or a knee-jerk reaction. Unlike Bar Kamsa, who went from conciliation to revenge in a moment of rage, the party host was calculating and well thought out in his reaction. The one who made the feast found Bar Kamsa, his sworn enemy, seated there. And what did he say to him? "Since you are my enemy, what are you doing here? Get up and get out." We can hear that calmness, that coldness in his voice. He calmly stood his ground and repeated his mantra, "You are my enemy," over and over. "You are my enemy. You must leave." The host of the party stood for his principles. Bar Kamsa was his enemy. This was his party. An enemy is not welcome at the party of his adversary. He was offered money and then offered, more money, and still he stuck to his principles. No money in the world could make him budge from what he believes was right. No convincing, no arguments, nothing could make him compromise his deeply held conviction. This man does not belong here, so he must leave. Imagine you made a wedding which cost you $60,000. Your sworn enemy offers to pay you for all of it, just to let him stay at the feast. It's not a bad deal at all. It's actually great. Let your enemy lose his money for your party. Yet the host, refused. He was a profoundly ideologically personality, guided 100% by principle. This man was not erratic. He remained consistent throughout the confrontation, his position unchanged. This was no burning moment of anger, no sudden flash of rage that possessed him and took over his senses. He was completely sensible, clear thinking, and decisive. My enemy had to go, and that's it. End of story. I'm not for sale. I'm a real person. I have dignity. I'm a person of principle. My friendship can't be bought for money. There are fights that happen spontaneously at a weak moment, unplanned and unexpected. These fights are irrational and unreasonable. They don't make any sense. There's no sense of proportion or fairness. But then there are fights that are completely rational and reasonable. There are thought-out hatred, premeditated enmity, principled conflict that can be justified with facts and rationalizations and ideology. Sometimes we attack someone because we know we are really in the wrong, but other times we attack with such belief that we're in the right. And indeed, we may even be right. Take this story as an example. The guest, Bar Kamsa, turns out to be a real scum, running to Rome to inform. Okay, his host then knew whom to hate. He truly felt this guy needs to be loathed, and he would not tolerate his presence at his respectable party. Here is the true message of the story. It was this hatred, a hatred dressed up in righteous garments, an inspired ideology that caused the destruction of the temple. And such principled hatred can easily destroy our miniature temples, our homes, and our family. As the Alter Rebbe once said, the first Chabad Rebbe once said, the most constructive arguments are those that are done for altruistic reasons. The most destructive arguments are those that pose as altruistic. Often, we get in to fight over good ideological reasons. She said this to me about my son. I will never talk to her again. In principle. He insulted me. I will hate him for the next 65 years. The most destructive and unjustified hatred is the one which is justified. So, what is the difference between children and adults? Children don't harbor grudges. They may declare with all sincerity, I hate you, and yet usually within 15 minutes, they become your best friend again. An adult, on the other hand, carries resentment sometimes for decades without forgetting and without forgiving. Why the difference? Because children choose being happy over being right. Adults choose being right over being happy. We all have to make this choice in our lives. Do we want to be right, or do we wish to be happy? Dear friends, wishing you an easy and meaningful fast. Yes, a meaningful fast. In a world filled with immediacy and indulgence, the countercultural act of fasting teaches us how to temper our most immediate urges. Let me explain. Modern life is one of immediacy and indulgence. With a swipe of a finger, any piece of information is just seconds away. Hungry? Tap a button and food will show up at your door. Thirsty? Pre-order your coffee and we'll have it waiting for you when you get there. Patience is no longer a virtue, it's an impediment. When we don't get all that we want at the very moment that we want it, we feel cheated and frustrated. Restraint is no longer celebrated, it's decried. In modern life, delayed gratification is archaic. The spirit of our age is one of unfettered and rapid consummation and consumption. In such a cultural moment, Judaism offers us a radical response. This revolutionary act, however, is not one of action, but one of inaction. It requires us to refrain, not to do. It asks us to take a moment to stop in an age where we are so hastily moving forward. It is this act of fasting, something that we're accustomed to do on this day of Tisha B'Av. And by the way, if we weren't aware of it being a fast day, the appropriate thing is to continue the rest of the day fasting until this evening, till about 10 to 9 p.m. Today, when we remember the several calamities of our past, including the destruction of the first and second temples of Jerusalem. You see, fasting is countercultural. We learn to temper our most immediate urges, and as we practice restraint, we learn that life's most transcendental moments are coming during introspection, not indulgence. As we cultivate that out-of-fashion virtue of patience, we soon realize that the world's most precious gifts comes to those who wait. In this way, when we fast, we inch closer to the divine. We reject our most primal proclivities and learn to moderate and restrain our earthly inclinations. And as on Tisha B'Av, the tragedies that befell our people, how did they respond? They stressed the importance of patience. Real meaning requires persistence and patience. Instantaneous indulgence will not suffice. As we fast, we remember all the trials peppered throughout our people's troubled history. And as we refrain from food and drink, let's appreciate the radicalness of our act. Submerged in a society that promotes immediate gratification and endless consumption, fasting teaches us the benefits of self-control and the virtue of patience and perseverance. True fulfillment and satisfaction won't come to those who indulge as quickly as possible, but rather to those who calmly and patiently pursue not the most goods, but the world's most sacred goods. Again, dear friends, so much to think about on this day. Again, I say, please have a most meaningful and uplifting fast. And may the Almighty bless us all very speedily. This day will be turned into days of happiness and joy in the highest manner with the coming of Mashiach. This is your host, Rabbi Perl.